Welcome back. We're going to pick up our discussion of the chunking method of comparison and contrast. So again, we're dealing with two topics. I picked two American cities, New York and Los Angeles. We've been through our discussion points that we're going to use. If you need to review those, please go back to the previous video. Now we're going to pick up and talk about, if this is our goal, how are we going to compose our introduction? And this is where I probably should pause and say that no matter which method of organization that you use, your introduction will probably be pretty much the same for either essay, because no matter which method of organization you use, your introduction still has to do some very basic things. First of all, your introduction does have to establish that basis of comparison. Why are you comparing these two things? What is the justification for that? What is the reader supposed to take from that? Why are they even reading this essay? Why do they need to know this, right? All right, so let's look at our introduction here. I said New York and Los Angeles are America's two largest cities, each representing a different side of American culture, East Coast and West Coast. So note here, I decided to make that the real focal point here. What are we going to take from this comparison? We're looking at how the two cities are very different culturally. But we're going to go back to that basis of comparison. That's what the next sentence does. Both cities attract millions of visitors each year. Both are home to unique American art forms, and each has its own distinct personality. There is our basis of comparison. But look what we do with that next sentence. We're going to immediately bridge that into our contrast, right? Because that's really where we're going to be focusing. But that is where the similarities end. It can be argued that the two cities that bookend America are cultural polar opposites. Now we've got the foundation for our comparison, right? It's established how we're going to frame that comparison. So again, once we get past the introduction, we're going to pick up with subject A. We established in the last video that in this instance, we're going to use New York as our subject A. What does that mean if you're using the chunking method? It means that we're going to go through all 3 or 4 of those talking points about subject A before we ever even get to subject B. All right, so notice here, if this were our essay, each of these would actually be its own paragraph. All right, so we're devoting a full paragraph to each of these distinct talking points about New York. We're not mentioning Los Angeles. We're not there yet. We haven't hopped on that plane yet. We're still in New York. And we're going to be in New York. We're going to hang out here for roughly about 4 paragraphs. Now, you will notice, if you think back to the original outline for this essay, we mentioned something about immigrants, but what happened was, as I revised, I started realizing that I didn't really have room in the discussion to talk about immigrants, and that it was not relevant really for what I wanted to discuss with this essay. So that's part of the revision process, right? Eventually you start to weed out those things that will not feel as relevant to your discussion. All right, but again, here, what were our talking points? We're going to talk about the weather. All right, so that's what this first paragraph does. We're going to talk about the people in New York. What does this third paragraph do? Notice the topic sentence. Just getting around can be a challenge too. Everyone, it seems, walks in downtown New York. That's our topic sentence that's going to bridge us into talking about transportation in New York. Then we're going to bridge into talking about New York's theatrical scene. All right, but the key there is we're going to get subject A completely discussed and out of the way before we move to subject B. So the key with the chunking method is you're going to have to think about where that transitional bridge is going to occur, right? Because if you go from subject A to subject B, there's got to be a point where you make that transition. That transition, it depends on the essay. It can be as brief or as long as it needs to be. It can be as brief as a single sentence, or it can be up to a full paragraph. It might even be a couple of paragraphs. That's going to vary, and it's going to depend on, again, your essay, your purpose, how quickly you want to make that transition. The key, though, is that the transition needs to be there. So let's say, okay, we'll go back to our essay. We've talked about all these points about New York, everything we want to say about New York. Let's say we put this paragraph in. But now, let's say we hop on a plane and travel to the other side of the country, to the United States' second largest city. When we step off the plane, it might seem as if we've landed in an entirely different universe from the one we left behind back on the East Coast. So note that this transition is doing a couple of things. It's getting us out of New York, right? And it's also setting the scene for what is going to be that contrast when we get to Los Angeles. It's going to be a very different world from the one we left behind, because the culture, the weather, everything is just going to be completely different when we get there. Now, once we're in Los Angeles, note that we're again going to go through those same discussion points. So again, each one of these each one of these bullet points here represents a new paragraph. So again, we're going to go through the weather. Now everything is temperate, pleasant. We're going to talk about the people. There's still a lot of hustle and bustle, but it has a very different vibe because people in California are generally more laid back, not as in a hurry to get to everywhere. What is the difference in transportation? In Los Angeles, people are more apt to be driving their own cars, so you're going to deal with the congestion of the freeways, etc. There is public transport, of course, but more people tend to drive in Los Angeles. And then we're going to talk about, of course, Hollywood as compared to Broadway. So that is really it in a nutshell. That is the chunking method of organization. So the key there is discussing completely all of your points about the first subject before you transition to the second subject. And this is where I will add that the chunking method works particularly well if you are only comparing, let's say, 2 to 3 subjects. Now, if you're comparing more than that, and sometimes there might be reason for you to be talking about, upwards of 4 or 5, even 6 subjects that you might be comparing and contrasting. I think once you get up to that number, then you're probably best to use the sequencing method, which is the next one that we'll talk about. But chunking works really well when there are relatively few subjects, or at least relatively few points of comparison that we're trying to make between the two subjects. All right, so next video we'll talk about sequencing. I will see you there.